Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with me, Dr. Peters. I was born and raised in New Hampshire and I completed my PhD at the University of Glasgow. My research looks at the intellectual history of the US Constitution and how that history, philosophy, political theory, and constitutional law can help us better understand and address contemporary social and political issues. What I'd like to chat about this week is the crisis of masculinity and how it's expressed and informs our conceptions of justice and our politics, both in terms of policy and action. What raises this question is the Secretary of Defense's assertions that the rules of war apparently do not apply to the United States anymore, the callous treatment of civilian and military deaths in this recent war, as well as the ongoing campaign against wokeness, and in the broader culture, figures like Elon Musk describing empathy as the greatest weakness of Western civilization. This conception of masculinity is advocated for and propagated throughout what's called the manosphere. This conception of masculinity essentially reduces masculinity to the capacity for violence and domination. It's a hierarchical structure where justice is realized by an individual through violence based on their own judgment. Think about the cowboy in the West that cleans up the streets with a trusty horse and a revolver. And this conception claims that there is a crisis of masculinity, that American men have become soft, weak, and effeminate. Now, I agree that there is a crisis of masculinity. However, I radically disagree with their conception of masculinity, what the causes of this crisis are, and what they actually look like, and thus what the solutions are. However, this is a discussion we all need to have and all should have a voice in. And so, as always, I'm going to use the founders, some philosophers, and political theorists to help us understand and explore what the crisis of masculinity is and what alternatives we have and what means we have to address it or to construct alternative conceptions of masculinity that make sense for men and for society. I think this is a conversation we desperately need to have and underlies many of the issues that we're facing today. So with that, let's look at the founding, especially because many read this conception of masculinity back into the American West and even the founding. So was it there? Well, yes and no. The American culture at the time of the founding was patriarchal. It was the 18th century. Men virtually represented their wives in politics and legally represented them. Abigail Adams describes this situation to her husband, John Adams, a founder and the second president of the United States, in her famous letter titled Remember the Ladies. In it, she reminds John that right now, men under law have the privilege of ruling over their wives like tyrants, and that many do. And she urges him to speak to the other founders who are at this time fighting a revolution to create a new country based on this concept of liberty and justice, to remember the ladies, to put laws in place that would better protect women and give them more autonomy. And she also includes a wee little threat. She says that if they don't, the ladies will not see themselves as bound to a law that they did not have a voice in making and would foment their own revolution, paralleling the rhetoric in the lead up to the revolution and even the Declaration of Independence. Now, she also reminds John that wouldn't it be better to exchange the title of master, the tyrant, for that of friend? And I say that this is a reminder because at the foundation of Abigail and John's marriage is this deep love, respect, and friendship. And so she's reminding him that he has already exchanged these titles and that he's far better off for it. Now, sadly, John and the founders do not remember the ladies as Abigail requested, to the detriment of men and women for the next 2 centuries, depending on how you determine the end of this tyrannical rule of husbands over their wives. Furthermore, the American culture at the founding was an honor culture, particularly in the southern colonies and later southern states. This is exemplified in the institution of the duel, where an individual could realize justice for injustices done to their honor through single combat. Now, at the time of the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, this institution was already starting to fade. However, this is how Alexander Hamilton met his fate at the hands of then Vice President Aaron Burr. So this idea of justice realized individually through violence was a part of American culture at the founding. So we can see certain parallels between this modern conception of masculinity, but even in comparison to the founding, this is a radical circumscription of masculinity and what being a man means. The founders were scholars, artists, poets. George Washington was remembered and praised for being a talented and enthusiastic dancer, something that simply would not fly in the Secretary of Defense and the Manosphere's conception of masculinity. They were builders and creators that gave birth to a nation and a code of laws that meant to uphold and protect the equality, liberty, and justice of all through objective due process and a democratic institution of the trial by jury. It's not one individual who gets to decide not only what the law is, but how it's enforced. We do this collectively to make sure that justice is just and that the laws really do apply to all of us, not just a few. Now, we can also see some of the seeds of this crisis of masculinity in the philosophy of John Locke. Many scholars argue Locke's philosophy was the primary influence on the founders and the U.S. Constitution. And one scholar even argues that Locke's political thought still has a pervasive grip on the American public's subconscious that is inhibiting us from realizing progress in politics currently. To formulate his conception of natural law, John Locke uses the state of nature. This is essentially a philosophical thought experiment that tries to imagine what the human condition looked like before the institution of government. Now, what this is meant to do is to help the philosopher imagine what human nature actually is without the pressure of government and institutions, and thus to discover what justice is and what kind of justice is natural to human beings, i.e., what is the natural law. Now, Locke's state of nature is largely populated by independent, self-sufficient, fully grown men who gather property by mixing their labor with natural resources. So if I pick an apple, it becomes my apple. If I cultivate or improve the land, it becomes my land. Even our natural right to life in Locke is based on our bodies being our property because we labor to maintain them. Now, from this, Locke draws the conclusion that essentially the rules that organize and allow society to function are property rights, and thus the chief end of government is the protection of property rights. This is the base level foundation that makes society possible. Now, modern scholars have pointed out that this conception of humanity is hyper-individualistic, and we can see the connection to rugged individualism. And they argue that this hollows out people and atomizes society because it ignores quintessential parts of the human condition that make society possible, make it function, and make it worth living in. Now, a brilliant scholar and theorist, Virginia Held, points out this oversight in Locke's state of nature and critiques it. She essentially asks, where in Locke's state of nature are these independent, self-sufficient men's mothers? Human beings do not reach adulthood without care, compassion, community, and empathy. It takes decades to get a human child from childhood to independence. And she argues that it is this care and community that allows for society and makes it function. And this critique is mirrored in James Wilson's theory, which should come as no surprise to regular viewers of this channel. James Wilson rejected Locke and followed the philosophy of his fellow Scot Thomas Reid in theorizing that humans are innately social, that justice is far more extensive than just property rights, and that the chief end of government is to protect and improve the society, kindness, and peace that was pre-existing in his conception of the state of nature. So from Wilson's radically different conception of the state of nature, we get a very different conception of human nature and the natural law. Following Reid, Wilson believed that human beings possess natural affections that lead us to have compassion, empathy, and care for others in our community, such as parents for children, romantic partners, friends, family, and even our broader community. And he and Reid pointed to these as what makes human beings naturally social. And they saw society as the very habitat for humanity, that it is necessary for our survival and for us to become fully human. Now, they talk about this in terms of language and reason and the development of knowledge, but also it's just a quintessential part of what it means to be human, to care on others, to have compassion, to have empathy. And because this is natural to humans, innate to us, and important for society, and thus the existence of the human species and human individuals, they recognize this in natural law. These are the imperfect rights that we discussed a few weeks ago in a chat. Now, imperfect rights recognize what Wilson and Reid describe as the duties of humanity and charity. Essentially, our duty to care for, have compassion for, have empathy for others and help them in times of need. Now, because this is natural law, Wilson and Reid both argue that this should be part of legislation, part of positive human law, and that this is part of the virtue of justice. This isn't just something nice to do, this is what justice demands. And they even argue at times that these imperfect rights take precedence over perfect rights, and particularly property rights. Accordingly, Wilson's chief end of government is the protection and improvement of society. This is a radically more extensive conception of justice and a far fuller and social conception of humanity. Now, while Wilson does not directly theorize masculinity, even though he spends 3 pages arguing that women are equal before sidestepping the issue, we can draw some ideas from this conception of humanity that could inform our formulation of what we want or think masculinity should look like. From this Wilsonian perspective, a great man or masculinity would include building, creating, nurturing, caring for a community and society. It would be realizing these duties of benevolence, humanity, and charity as a duty of justice. And thus, masculinity would necessarily include some conception or expression of care, compassion, and empathy. This is a radically different starting point than the manosphere's conception of masculinity that circumscribes and reduces masculinity to violence and dominance. So with that, what is the crisis of masculinity? The Secretary of Defense and the manosphere would argue that the crisis is the weakening and softening of men, wokeness, effeminization, things of that sort. And by identifying the crisis as such, it identifies a particular solution. Men need to be toughened up. And how they propose to toughen up men is forcing them into a hierarchical structure that rewards the capacity for violence and aggression. It's a structure that is built on domination, where might makes right, and it views empathy, compassion, and care, those quintessential aspects of what makes us human and makes society possible, as weakness. And thus, men are not allowed to express it. Alternatively, I would identify a key facet of the current crisis of masculinity as this manosphere version of masculinity. It's antithetical to democracy, being hierarchical in nature, as well as the promises of equality, liberty, and justice for all that our nation was founded on. Moreover, it's dehumanizing for men and destructive of society. And thus, I would propose starting from a Wilsonian foundation and formulating a conception of masculinity from there. This would start by looking at what does care, compassion, empathy, and community look like through the lens of masculinity. Now, some in the manosphere would probably argue I'm trying to teach men to act like women, or essentially make young boys weak and soft and effeminate. In response, I would argue that if we say men and boys are not allowed to express these quintessential aspects of what it means to be human, things like care, compassion, empathy, and community that allow society to exist, which in turn allows for humans to become fully developed and fully human, we are inherently dehumanizing them and keeping them from becoming fully human. And I think we see the symptoms of this dehumanization in statistics that illustrate that young men are more likely to suffer from addiction, to die deaths of despair, and to commit suicide, that they're doing worse than their female counterparts in things like education, career, and home ownership, that they suffer from despair, isolation, friendlessness, loneliness, depression. They are not in a good place. And that also makes them very vulnerable to radicalization. We see this in organizations like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and the incel community, where disenchanted young men go looking for what it means to be a real man, to be masculine. They go to the manosphere as the only place that's actually discussing masculinity. And because of this dehumanization and despair, young men are not only radicalized, but they respond to this frustration and hopelessness through violence. And we see this in the rise of political violence at home in things like mass shootings or the ridiculous number of attempted and successful political assassinations of late. This was not a normal thing 10, 15 years ago. We also see this in international relations with the callousness in which certain groups discuss the death of civilians and soldiers alike, as well as with the ease that they commit and discuss war crimes if accurately reported. Switzerland, who has been neutral for 400 years, broke that neutrality recently to accuse the United States and Israel of committing war crimes in Iran. And I see the ease with which this administration, and particularly Defense Department, is willing to commit those war crimes, according to Switzerland, as growing out of this narrow, reduced, violent conception of masculinity. So what this manosphere conception of masculinity does is it dehumanizes young men by removing or preventing them from feeling and expressing conceptions of compassion, empathy, and care. And in doing so, it allows them to more easily dehumanize others and be okay with unjust and dehumanizing acts. What it does is it turns young men into petty bullies and enforcers for elite men higher up in this hierarchy. This is not good for young men, society, democracy, anyone. And if we don't address it, we'll only get more of it. So how do we address this crisis of masculinity? I think the first way, and it's a relatively easy way, is that we start talking about it. Right now, the only place young men can look for conceptions of masculinity is the manosphere that is presenting this narrow, one-dimensional, violent, domineering conception of masculinity to them. That's all they have to look at. So as a society, we need to start to formulate a conception of a masculinity, and particularly American masculinity, that works, is true, and healthier for everyone. Because this radical conception of masculinity is not only not good for anyone, but isn't even masculinity. It's just kind of being a dick. And luckily for us, we don't have to start this conversation from scratch. We can follow the example of women who had their own conversation about femininity in what we've come to know as the feminist movement. Now, many people misinterpret feminism as primarily hating men, which is not the case at all. Many feminists and queer theorists have already begun discussing and looking at the crisis of masculinity with a deep compassion for men and a deep valuing of masculinity. And they've invited men to join in on this conversation to figure it out because they recognize that we're all interdependent, that society requires everyone working together. And if there are groups in our society that are not doing well, we'll all be better off if we help each other, if we extend care, compassion, and empathy to one another. Those quintessential human things that make society work and make human existence possible and worth doing. Now, this isn't to say that I or these theorists have all the answers. Actually, we all recognize that it can't be something that one person or one theory answers. One of the major problems with this patriarchal conception of masculinity is that it is hierarchical, that it's people on top enforcing their views on the people at the bottom. So if we want to formulate a conception of what masculinity could and should look like today and how it can be expressed, it has to be a collective conversation. So in this instance, making a decision is not deciding what you think masculinity in the United States should look like. It's deciding to have the conversation, to start talking about it and recognizing that there is a problem, and a problem that is affecting all of us and is dangerous for society and democracy and our young men. So for now, I'll leave you to ponder that. As always, thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting and informative. As always, feel free to share comments and questions in the comment section below. If you like this content, feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel or Substack. Also, take a look at the essay that goes into a little bit more detail on the subject. I put out new essays and videos every Friday, so feel free to come back next week for more content or subscribe so you get a notification. For now, thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.